button and then we'll get started.
Hi, this is Jen speaking. Welcome. This evening's Zoom has automated Rev Live captioning available to use by clicking the transcript button on the bottom right side of your screen in the Zoom toolbar. I wanted to say that the last day to apply for the Fern Performance Series is tomorrow, Friday, April 9th. And yeah, you can call me Jen. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a queer white woman. I have a shaved head and I'm wearing glasses, a black short sleeve shirt, and small hoop earrings. I'm sitting in my bedroom and I'm a dancer, a mother, and a partner. I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from Muncie Lenape land, now called Greenpoint, Brooklyn. In the spirit of pedagogy, I would like to recognize all of our teachers within and the learning of practical forms, and importantly, teachers that arrive in the form of experiences, interactions, research, and imaginations, intuition, a gathering, negotiating a busy sidewalk, and reflection, among others. I'm thinking about the address and how it reverberates in space and in body, how presentation and words reverberate, resonate, and resurge. I'm thinking about memory and memoriam. I would like to thank Kendra Portier, Shannon Murphy, Donna Faye Birchfield, Sophia Engelman, Anna Maynard, Jenn Pollins, and freeskewl for supporting me in this endeavor. The proposal for these evenings is an action. The talks themselves, the actions, presenting ideas and questions in front of you and with you, this being an invitation for you to be a part of this action tonight as well. During these talks, you are the collective, and we are a collective together tonight. The community agreement and optional payment methods have been placed in the chat, and you can also locate these materials on the website at www.freeskewl.com. I'm going to read the community agreement to you. Let's see. Please be respectful to all in the Zoom room. Harassment and discrimination of any kind will not be tolerated. freeskewl is firmly in support of the Black Lives Matter movement. We care about the safety of our community, and this includes people who are disabled, immigrants, refugees, BIPOC, Latinx, queer, trans, young, elderly, Muslim, and Jewish. You can privately message Sophia and M or email freeskewl, freeskewl, freeskewl team at gmail.com at any time if you feel unsafe. freeskewl reserves the right to remove anyone who does not abide by our community agreement. I'm almost done. As the talk is in process, we will not be tending to the chat. During our time together, we will open up to a group conversation, and anyone can choose to unmute and speak aloud. When doing so, please say your name. For instance, this is Jen speaking. If the chat is preferred, that is okay. And please know that myself or Sophia will read the question aloud to the group. You can also email Sophia at freeskewl@gmail.com, freeskewl@gmail.com with your question, and we will read it aloud. We will take a 2-minute break halfway through before opening up to a larger conversation. And please be as comfy as you like, and feel free to have your camera off or on. And now I'm excited to pass the evening on to Laura Tuthall and Audre L. Thank you.
Me, I'm going first. This is Laura speaking. We're going to start by just kind of telling you who we are. We'll do some visual descriptions. My name is Laura Tuthall. I use they and she pronouns. I'm one half of Hyp-ACCESS. I'm calling in from Lenape-Hoking, specifically what's now known as Bushwick, Brooklyn. And let's see, I'm a thin white woman, white femme really is a more accurate description. Short ginger hair. I'm wearing over-the-ear headphones, tinted big frame glasses, a necklace made by Audre with hematite and kind of iridescent stones, and a black jacket. You can see my dresser behind me and a poster of Marsha P. Johnson. Let's see, I'm an artist, but most of what we do is care access coordination for other people with hypermobile disabilities. We'll talk more about what we do. Is there anything I'm forgetting, Audre?
This is Audre speaking. I don't think so, but the nice thing is we have this whole time. So if you do forget, you could say it when you remember.
That's true. That's true. Your turn.
Yeah, my turn. Okay. Hello, my name's Audre. I'm the other half of Hyp-ACCESS. I use she, her pronouns. I'm also calling from Lenape-Hoking. And I am also a thin white femme with half blonde, half brown, shoulder length hair. I'm sitting in a pink, like quilted padded chair that kind of looks like a seashell. And I'm wearing big clear glasses and a chunky plastic like red chain. And there are bookshelves behind me. And yeah, I guess I'm also an artist, but Laura and I'm also a scientist, but Laura's also a scientist too. We all do the things together. So yeah, I guess we'll talk a little bit about what we do and kind of maybe introduce hypermobility, right, Laura? Is that what we're planning?
Yeah, I think so. But our idea is for this to be pretty informal. We'll probably talk for a while, maybe have some questions back and forth with Jenn, and then we'll have plenty of time for group conversation. Yeah, I think that's the plan.
Yeah.
Would you like to start?
Sure. This is Audre speaking again. So Hyp-ACCESS is short for hypermobile access, and I apologize for the sounds out on the street. They're going to be coming in and out. And hypermobility is a greater than normal range of motion. That is the definition of hypermobility. It is widespread if it's in 4 or more joints. And generally, if it's widespread, that indicates connective tissue differences that could be inherited, acquired, or both. And oftentimes it is both. And oftentimes it's both because hypermobile people are, naturally flexible. I'm making air quotes. And so we find a lot of the hypermobile people in dance, actually. And what's interesting is that it has really become an aesthetic that we say fetishize. And what else am I saying? With that fetishization, that kind of like historic increase in fetishization of hypermobility, also came the care denial of hypermobile conditions, kind of in the same era, kind of eugenics, post-eugenics. I think Laura and I agree that we're still in a eugenic era. It never really ended. And so there's a lot of intersection of care denial, arts practice, somatic practice development, kind of the way that modern medicine developed in tangent with all of these things. So we kind of work in all of them in some ways. And I'm going to end there. And then Laura, do you have anything else to say?
Yeah, I mean, that's why we work in every field. We work in research. We call this people science. This is a practice we learned from disability justice organizers, really science and research for the people that the research is about, because that's the way it should be, but that's not the way that the medical or research, we call them industrial complexes, work. So we do research, we do like really broad education about hypermobility as a disability, as a spectrum of disability, and arts programming, accessibility consulting. I must be forgetting something. Oh, right, we developed our own somatic therapy. I think it's funny when we forget that one, but that's really kind of part of this, trying to get care to people in any way we can. We met in an Alexander Technique training program that was absolutely not accessible, really toxic, abusive environment. But we developed, well, I've been developing practices for making that work more accessible for hypermobile people and disabled people specifically. And Audre came in and had a neuroscience background, started talking about like the theory behind why that work was helping. That sensory motor theory. I'm sure we'll talk about that later. And then we, from that, and from combining that with disability justice praxis, which is just that framework, those theories, we'll talk more about disability justice too, really developed a completely new thing that we call awareness-based neuromuscular repatterning, which is a mouthful of a name, ABNR for short, and we named it that for research science reasons. Yeah, let's see. I'm not sure what else right off the bat. I mean, the reason that we kind of teach and associate with the dance community a lot is because of how concentrated hypermobility is here. We kind of view it as, not kind of, we really view dance as exploiting the aesthetic of hypermobility while continuing to kind of tell people that their experience isn't real, minimize any effects of pushing the body to those what dance might think of as really beautiful, kind of fetishized superhuman aesthetics. And then, you know, in medicine, people are completely denied care. And then in somatics, it isn't accessible. So that's why we're in these communities, to try to get people care. And yeah, we're going to share as much information as we can, and then definitely share links to resources with you as well. Yeah, and thought. And then I think, Jen, do you have any questions you want to start us off with?
Sure. Well, I wondered if you could explain a little bit the awareness-based neuromuscular repatterning, but also there was one, and I scribbled so many notes, and I think when you write or speak or practice the proprioceptive practices, and then you use this term reweighting, and I just got like latched on a little bit to that, like, and I wasn't sure, I had imaginations of what it could be, and I wondered if you could talk about that a little bit.
This is Audre speaking. Laura, am I good to come in here? Okay.
Yeah, do your thing. Yeah.
Okay. So we're jumping into the science kind of right off the bat, and I hope that that's okay with everyone. Bear with me. Please let me know if I'm not making sense. I can really get into like a spiral of my own thoughts. But so Laura was the first person to teach me that I didn't have to feel pain. And I was like, what do you mean? Like, excuse me, this is a choice, and sometimes it's not a choice, but in spaces that often normalize pain, I think it was a, revolutionary moment for me internally. And then I started working with Laura, and I noticed that what was really or what we were noticing was really working was not necessarily this kind of practice with dogma that's like, you know, head is up and forward and the heel on the through line with the mid, you know, whatever, like radiating from the center, which is fine. Like those things work for some people. But really what was working and what was kind of shifting the way that hypermobile people's joints were not in their sockets all the time was just Laura making a really specific form of contact. And this really goes with sensory motor theory. And we think that this is one of the reasons that somatic practices generally, and I guess when we're talking about somatic practices, we're specifically talking about like white Western practices. Our experience is primarily the Alexander technique in that, you know, realm, but then it really, you know, Laban notation kind of from the eugenic era, air quotes, because it's still the eugenic era to now, all of these somatic practices that are very prevalent in contemporary dance spaces. So, and also in myself, I was kind of like, why is touch making so much more sense than anyone telling me to do something or to think something, or, you know, and when I was in college, before I was diagnosed and I was very, very sick, and I went to Bennington College, one of my professors paid for an Alexander technique lesson of mine. And because I was going to all these doctors and blah, blah, blah. And I came out of the lesson and I was like, whoa, this is really different. This feels really wild. I study neuroscience. This feels woo-woo. I don't get it. So I actually started doing my own research, and I was looking at motor planning signatures in the brain using electroencephalography, which is like where you see people have that kind of cap of circles or something, or they have kind of all of these electrodes that are in this thing and these like wires coming out of the top of their head. I mean, it's a cap, it's not in, but, and I was also looking at features of movement execution, which just in science means movement, making a movement. So I was also looking at like muscle activation patterns, and then kinematic analysis of a limb, basically someone's arm going to push a button and then like putting their hand back down in like the box that I outlined in tape. You know, it wasn't super fancy. And the data ended up being quite good. So we redid the study a few times, and lo and behold, somatic practices shift the way that the brain, organizes movement on a kind of cortical organization level. So I wasn't necessarily looking at connections. I was looking at activity and how that activity is happening, and, you know, in relation to the movement and the muscle activation and stuff like that. So I came out of college knowing that somatics impacted cortical organization, which was something that hadn't really been talked about in science. A lot of somatic work is often in kind of like the psychotherapy realm, or yeah, anyway, so reweighting. So the way that the sensory motor system works is essentially in connective tissue are all of these receptors that respond to changes in tissue. The change could be a temperature change, the change could be a pressure change, the change could be an increase or a decrease in pain. So those receptors all sense those things, and they're basically the same receptor, and they're in the connective tissue. And connective tissue surrounds muscle fibers, it surrounds nerve tracts, and organizes them together into what we would, you know, look at as like the whole nervous system, or, you know, a whole body of belly of muscle. So those receptors, based on those changes, send feedback to the nervous system that then is integrated, that then informs the next action. But it's never really like one and then the other. It's like always happening at the same time. And so observing Laura, you know, internally, and then also working with other people and learning from Laura, I was like, oh my goodness, touch is the thing. Like the contact is what we call reweighting the sensory information, which basically just means that we're providing a change in stimuli, or like the weight of that thing, if it's like less or more. That's kind of, I think, how scientists mean that, but you know, this could be interpreted probably in many ways. And then what that does is that increase in sensory information is going to, regardless of if someone is actively aware of it or not, going to go back through the nervous system and then inform the way that the nervous system is then coordinating movement going forward. So with, we good? Is everyone kind of with me? I see some nods. Okay. So what I was observing Laura do was reweight someone's, you know, basically reception in the tissues that they were making contact. And then what that would do is it would provide the nervous system more information about those cutaneous tissues that have been influenced by pain, fatigue, potentially like tissue damage, you know, whatever. And it's not that, okay, I'm not going to go there yet, but so what I saw Laura doing was really like clarifying information for the nervous system about like cutaneous tissues, which when I say cutaneous, I mean between joints. And actually there are more of these receptors in between joints that contribute to balance, that contribute to coordination, that contribute to muscular activation than in the joints. So a lot of times people really focus on, you know, proprioception in the joints. This is how we sense our bodies. And science tells us differently. And I think also though, movement, people who move a lot know this, that like, you don't just sense your joints, that there's really this pretty full, you know, all of the tissues kind of providing you information between joints as well. Yeah, so we kind of figured out that by distilling what we thought was really working about somatic practices that we had experienced and kind of throwing out all the other stuff that was quite harmful, and they can exist together, you know, in a practice that can be harmful and also helpful at the same time in different ways. We started thinking about accessibility from not just a disability justice point of view, but also from a sensory motor theory point of view, that like, and they kind of are the same thing. Like it's really not about how someone is engaging, like that is a choice and that is someone's autonomy. And it's really, well, then we get into the sensory intuition thing. So maybe I'll pause there. And does anyone have any questions about that before we go on?
Might jump in to say a few things. This is Laura, but we also welcome clarifying questions. I'll hold a moment. All right, and if you have any, you can hang on to them. But I think I'll just elaborate a bit on what that kind of meant in practice and like how that informed what we do. And this is similar to work being done by many disability justice organizers. I'm just going to define a few things before I elaborate in case anyone isn't familiar. So proprioception is like, I mean, they say it's the sense of where the body is in space, the nervous system sense. It's a little more complicated than that. It has to do with these receptors, but it's generally like felt sense of your existence. And it's very, very impaired in people with hypermobility and connective tissue differences, and it becomes more impaired and more affected when those tissues are damaged and when there's a lot of pushing the body and like getting that leg up, and proprioceptive, what medicine would call deficits, kind of like missing spaces in your body, places you can't feel as accurately, are really, really common. And then disability justice is very, very different from disability rights. That's more of a legal, like, we should all have access to the American dream thing. Disability justice is more about abolishing systems. It's a movement that's created in the last 20 or so years by Black and Indigenous, queer and trans disabled people. You might want to check out Sins Invalid, and a main place that we learn from, a main community, is Health Justice Commons. So yeah, with the sensory motor theory and like what we started figuring out with like the early stages of ABNR when we were still in what we call the cult, was, I think, something that is really common in people's science movements, where we need to take what's useful from many of these disciplines and really throw out a lot. And the way that that information is accessed really doesn't support the people who need the information, doesn't support their autonomy. Like Audre talked about, I provided an alternative for, you know, the choice to not be in pain. But these somatics communities, it's interesting what choice means, because they might say, it's your choice to be happy, or it's your choice to feel that pain or not. You just need to move through it. But that's not what choice is. That's imposing some kind of value system on someone's body. So them making the choice to maybe limit what they're doing, to not be standing, to be lying down, to take something easy, to rest. These are the choices that we think about. And I mean, I think it's all part of the eugenic origins of these practices, because the dogma is full of hyper-individualism, which is this main tool of capitalism and eugenics. It's the person needs to overcome, they need to take it upon themselves to figure out how to improve their situation, when we really think that they need access to resources and information for that to even be possible, and it should really be a communal responsibility. But in these communities like Alexander technique, there's this idea that someone has to be, Audre referenced this as well, that someone has to be aware, they have to really be applying themselves kind of intellectually for that, in quotes, mind body, what they also sometimes call repatterning to take place. But when we actually look at the science and we actually look at what happens when you do these touch-based things, that is not necessary. And that is one of the first things I started noticing when I started taking on students, that they did not need to be, in quotes again, paying attention. They could be talking about their kids. They could be talking about how hard it is to be in this pain, and to not have that acknowledged by medicine, by whoever, by their partners, their family, their friends, themselves. And when they left the lesson, just from getting that hands-on work, something else was going on. Something was happening differently in how the nervous system, as we know now, is organizing that movement and kind of outputting to all the layers of the body. And that really kind of turned on its head what the somatics community was feeding us in this education that we had to go through to become certified teachers, that you needed to pay attention. It was always better to be standing. You needed to kind of think about the head in this way that's incredibly dangerous for hypermobile people. This kind of very, very ableist premium on a certain kind of really physical and really kind of hyper individualistically applied way of thinking and moving. And we, that wasn't true. And we didn't want to impose that kind of thinking on our community, on our students, that they needed to be doing anything, that they actually had that responsibility to change their lives when really they're being deprived of things they have a right to. And in what we consider those rights, we include proprioceptive therapy, because that is information that hypermobile and disabled and all bodies need in order for, the impacts of the terrible medical system and the impacts of, living and working in a capitalist society to have minimal impacts, or for people's quality of life. We really talk about quality of life a lot, for that to be valued and improved and prioritized. And it's very tricky because all the places that you can learn a lot of these skills, they impose that kind of ableist and eugenic and very, very racist and sexist, when we're talking about Alexander technique specifically, thought paradigm in order for you to access those resources. And that's definitely why we do somatics and why we created the practice we did, so that there's an alternative and people can have access to that therapy without having to be in that environment. Is there anything you want to add, Audrey?
Like so many things, but I forgot like half of them already. This is Audrey speaking. Yeah, I guess like what's really interesting is like when I'm listening to Laura talk about this stuff, I'm like, and this is exactly how it works in science too, where there's this really ableist value system that's like, the way we're running research and the reason we're doing the things we're doing is to increase capitalist productivity of, human bodies, and disability, should be eliminated, which is also a very Alexander technique goal. So FM Alexander, and this is well documented, like you can just Google it. But FM Alexander actually was like one of the BFFs with all of the really major scientific and academic eugenicists in the UK and in the US that really, we were joking the other day, they were all probably on amphetamines all the time, but they really like imparted this whole intellectualized, I'm doing air quotes again, way of killing people without, admitting that they're killing people, and controlling the masses. And Alexander technique actually in like around 1910, FM Alexander started calling it a practice of race culture, which was synonymous at the time with eugenics, because eugenics is, about race primarily. So anyway, these, what's really interesting is that somatics, and I also think then that kind of trickles into dance and medicine and science, both took on the same model of disability, which is this idea that, these things shouldn't exist, and, it's kind of your fault if they exist, and you're the one who, needs to do something about it. Yeah. And the other thing I wanted to say though was that like proprioception, the felt sense, is a feedback mechanism, and that these receptors, that information basically changes the way that muscle tone is outputting, and that's an automatic process. So that's not something that like needs to necessarily be controlled. Like I think that process is like really this thing that maybe we kind of let do its own thing, which can be safer often. And in all of the autonomic systems in our body, like the cardiovascular system, you know, GI, lungs, blah, blah, blah. Anything that has a motor component, those receptors in that connective tissue is that feedback mechanism. So like even in your heart, basically you have this, you know, here's the bottom, one of those bottom chambers. I'm kind of making like a U shape with my hand. And there's a bundle of nerve cells called the AV node. It doesn't really matter what it's called, but it's like close to it. It's really not near the spinal cord at all. And they're the receptors in the connective tissue that surround the part of that muscle essentially like feels the blood pressure increase as it goes in. And then once it hits a threshold, that information gets sent to the AV node, and then the AV node goes, okay, squish, and then it squishes. So in hypermobile conditions, because it affects connective tissue, and connective tissue houses the feedback mechanism of every single motor system in the body, it ends up often manifesting as like complex, multi-system, chronic situations that have that component to them. Yeah, to kind of connect it all. I think that's it. Yeah.
This is Laura speaking. I'm wondering if anyone has any questions. I definitely could talk more about kind of the historical development of all these ableist and anti-disabled and very bad for hypermobile people things developing in these fields. This is also pretty dense. Any clarifying questions, any thoughts, observations?
This is Jen. Could I ask a more of a inquiry onto a how or what happens? I think it was spoken to the other talk, questions of what lives in the body, and that can the data be interpreted by the people who are having the experience? And then I just want to turn to something I wrote down, and then I want to ask a question on how the dialogue happens. And maybe, I don't know if this is in your thought track, but that trauma is embodied and not always cognitive. And I wondered that, I'm asking that because I think at one point you spoke to that sometimes trauma or habitual repatterning that is harmful is so layered in that that the nervous system can be spoken to, perhaps through proprioception, but that, and maybe this speaks to, but that you're not telling someone what they should feel and that they should do this action, but you're having a conversation about family or the day or what's going on. But in turn, are you, as you're holding or waiting or mobilizing, do you talk to the person you're with about what you're doing? Like you just talk to us? Or yeah, just wondered about that kind of more poetic or practice process.
This is Laura speaking. To address that last bit, it's really going to depend. Some people want to talk about the science while you're doing it. Some people want to talk about TV shows. Some people want to talk about anatomy. And for some people, focusing on anything in the body is really not helpful, especially when there's unmanaged pain from literal decades of care denial. But for others, talking about it is really helpful. I mean, I think the autonomy is the bit we go back to, so that it is more about the person's choice about how they want to go about any kind of somatic work, than it is about, I guess that is what our pedagogy is. So, I mean, and there are parts that are really important with that when it comes to dialogue, like really frequent and consistent consent practices, and reporting, and, you know, helping the client or student or whatever we're going to call it, the person receiving touch or education, feel like they are allowed to say that something hurts, allowed to report increases in any kind of symptom they might be experiencing. Audrey?
This is Audrey speaking. I was going to say some people fall asleep, you know, and we also, touch isn't for everyone either. I mean, I think generally the way we approach it is everyone coming in has PTSD, and everyone is going to be, if they choose, if they want to do, you know, on their own journey of figuring out what works for them and what doesn't. And it's not for us to say, this is what's going to work for you, or this is what's not going to work for you. We come at it really more with like a hypermobile specific harm reduction approach. So how do the kinds of like spasticity and instability patterns, you know, if they shift too quickly, that can be really a problem. And also, you know, yeah, just making sure that we're really, what we're interested in facilitating a practice of is like care access. Like, does this feel okay? Does this not feel okay? You know, what do you want? Like, how is this a space where we can practice like, okay, now here's a moment to check in, any readjustments necessary, you know, the timing of things doesn't really matter. Like, it's yeah, I mean, there are very specific things we might not do, like go to somebody's head and neck. That is not something we'll do. And we can talk more about why. But we also definitely have a dialogue, you know, when we meet someone about like sharing as much as they're comfortable with about their body history and their body experience. We often end up in conversations that really are about care access, and people who, I mean, even like in myself, it's like, once I start to notice that maybe that there's pain there, it's like, oh, whoa, I was like really not with that. I like was dissociating from it and going into refeeling something that relates to chronic injury. It's popping on the block over here. Going into chronic injury. Oh, people can have flashbacks, you know, and that's something that's very common. And so the other thing about this work is like, that can be too much. And, you know, really providing space for people to titrate their own experience. And we're saying that over and over again, and really naming like sensory intuition is the thing to follow. And so even if someone can't necessarily verbalize or fully explain why, okay, they're going to place their arm this way, or maybe they want to get up and da-da-da, or, you know, whatever, to go with it. Because ultimately, who's sensing? It's you. And so, you know, with kind of along with the care denial, and then like the exploitation of like the physical range, there's it can be really hard to trust that intuition or know kind of what is going on, even though it might be really impactful. And so it's really less about like helping someone fix themselves. Like that's, you know, where a lot of what we do is like talk about like, yeah, and these things are going to fluctuate your entire life. And it's, you know, finding what works for you and how to feel supported. And the idea of that elimination or that fixing, that kind of really eugenic framework can just be really harmful, and especially internally, I think. I know I went on a whole thing. Yeah, can data be interpreted by the people with the experience? They should be. All data should be interpreted by the people with the experience. And the people who should be doing the studies are the ones with the experience and asking the questions and designing, you know, the whole thing. I think something that, well, hopefully people are realizing how violent the medical industrial complex is. And then what I also want to say is the research industrial complex, which is really housed in academia, right? And people think, oh, these, you know, teaching hospitals that are attached to academia where all of this specialized medicine is like really coming out of, there's a perception that that's really the best medicine that exists. And we would argue that that's actually the most violent, because it's so connected with this idea of objectivity and studying subjects and teaching. I mean, a lot of these teaching hospitals are just not very well managed. Everyone is exploited. This is the thing. Everybody in the whole system is exploited. So the people who are being harmed within the system are then harming people outside of the system or who are coming into the system. You know, it's the whole thing. And research, in our opinion, is really to support the continuation of that power dynamic in relation to identity and pathologizing identity. And so when we talk about care access and care justice, I think there's a important delineation between like pathologizing identity and providing someone options to improve their quality of life, and respecting someone's choice on how they're going to navigate those options and supporting them in that. So, you know, yeah, it's like facilitating access needs and being like, cool, that's what you need. Great, you know, and that's kind of it.
This is Laura jumping in. I mean, there's so much to say. But yeah, I mean, on the practical end of this, when we are working with someone, it doesn't necessarily end up being somatic therapy. It could end up they need help fundraising so they can see a certain physician, or they need help getting or affording medications. Maybe they just need like an artistic outlet. Like it's really about all around what can improve that person's quality of life and what they want. But then when we're interfacing with all these systems, I mean, and Audre, you're really getting at this, all the, like this turn of the century time, we're talking like late 1800s, early 1900s, and sustaining until today. For anyone who doesn't know what eugenics is, it was like a thought system for, in quotes, the betterment of humankind. But what they usually meant was white men ruling the world and controlling everyone else for capitalist gain, usually. I mean, we associate it with the Nazis, but it's really a whole Western thing, really, really propelled in America specifically. And then, so that created what we now know as specialty medicine. There's actually a report funded by eugenicist groups, the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, where they sent someone to learn from German medical education style, come back and make a report about it. This is called the Flexner Report of 1910. And then after that, a whole bunch of like alternative health care and health training places were shut down. People even went to prison for practicing alternative or holistic care. I think all but 2 Black medical schools were shut down. Just the number of people who were able to access medical training reduced astronomically. And then it's this whole eugenicist idea of objectivity, like Audre said, of making the doctor a scientist or a researcher, even if they're not actually trained in science or in research methods, making them this objective observer who really sees their patients as test subjects. And there's a whole huge, terrible history of the effects that this had, especially within the United States, when it comes to especially racial medical abuse. But what it created today is this really disconnected specialty medicine, all these different kinds of specialists who only treat one system. It also created somatics, people who think in the same way. They're using that same medical model of disability from this eugenic origin, focusing on eradicating and fixing people with disabilities, chronic illnesses, any kind of not, in quotes, normal. There really is no normal experience. And they're even discussing their students with each other as case studies, not necessarily with any consent. Whether they're thinking about, a lot of people get into medicine and somatics because they want to help people or because of their personal experience with pain when it comes to somatics. But it's really the same system. And then when we look at how dance developed with that and how hypermobility fits into this, I think it starts to make sense why our community is in the situation they're in, because hypermobility is a connective tissue difference. It affects every system in the body. Specialty medicine is never going to be able to care for it. And then when we look at who has hypermobility, this is wild, these statistics. It's statistics time. So about 20% of the global population is on the spectrum of hypermobile disability, we call it. Although not everybody's going to identify as disabled. Not everybody, the majority of those people have no idea that this might be why they're experiencing what they're experiencing. But that's 1 in 5 people on that spectrum. And then it's about twice as common in people who are assigned female at birth. So when we think about how medicine has treated women, femmes, gender nonconforming people, this becomes really clear as well, why this was neglected. It's about twice as common in people of color. So it really becomes clear that the eugenics are the reason why we're in this situation. And this has affected dance so much. You actually see in the so it's a genetically inherited thing, although they've never found the gene and they probably never will because it's too common and too complicated. You see it happen in the research of especially like the 1950s era, where people were before saying, oh, hypermobility in dance might be a liability, they called it. They were observing how people got more frequently injured. And then as, the tutu rose in height and people wanted to get their leg up more, and as medicine became kind of more entrenched, they weren't calling it eugenics anymore post-Nazis, but they were definitely doing that, researching genetic causation of disease kind of as the paramount goal of lots of medicine. We're looking at like the Human Genome Project that came around 2000. And then suddenly they're saying that hypermobility is an asset in papers about hypermobile dancers. So the eugenics and exploitation are really intertwined. And it's so intertwined with ableism and sexism and racism. And it becomes really, really clear. And once you see it, once you observe it, you see it everywhere. It's really tricky because the information access is so non-existent. The care is so non-existent. So we're not here to tell anyone who they are, what their experience means to them. But the function of all these systems has been to tell people their experience isn't real, to gaslight them. It's a main tool in medicine and somatics. When people experience pain in dance, they're taught to hide it. They're taught to overcome it. They're taught that they just need to get stronger, which when we understand the connective tissue physiology doesn't actually make any sense. They need information to their tissues and to their nervous system before their musculature can actually organize. I digress. These tools that have been used to minimize these experiences over this period of time and deny people care in all these systems really teach people that they don't know what their experience is. So that's why we talk about it so much and in all these fields. But it's tricky because it's just such a gap in understanding and everyone's understanding in medicine and in dance where this is so prevalent, and in related communities like somatics. Whew.
And this is Audre. And like, who went to the ballet in the 1940s? Doctors.
The rich doctors, yes.
And was like, oh, wow. You know, I mean, I just imagine these people being like, oh, that's an interesting person. And thinking about breeding, a lot of these people were, they had like, what do you call it? They like bred animals in their home. Like they lived in New York City and they had like rooms where they would breed, you know, species, and they would do kind of observe through generation and try and understand, to really form the field of medical genetics. This was like the beginning of medical genetics. And it also really intertwines with industrial design. So the idea of minimalism, efficiency, you know, mass production. This is all really based in eugenics.
Literally
and then
every system.
And what was I going to say? So they bred, and Victor McCusick, we're giving you like such a history lesson, but so Victor McCusick is the father of medical genetics, is what they call him. He died in 2008. He was the, you know, director of something at Johns Hopkins forever. He's like, you know, people in medicine are like, you are God, you know, in a lot of ways. And he started becoming the father of medical genetics actually by studying hypermobile families. And so they knew from the jump that there was this inherited connective tissue difference that, you know, sometimes, you know, there was this whole spectrum of things. And in 1956, in like Copenhagen or something, I don't know, they call it like the birthplace of medical genetics. That's what he presented on, was hypermobile inheritance. And then he discovered the single genes for more rarer types of EDS. And that's what really made him famous, is because he was the first one to find these single point mutations or multiple point mutations or substitutions, which basically all I'm saying is it's like, you know, we look at the whole thing and we can narrow it down by process of elimination to this change. And that change is consistent, you know, within this quote unquote population that they're working with. So hypermobile EDS, which is the kind that Laura and I both experience and is the kind that is the most common, and who knows if it's going to be called this in 20 years. We also expand the definition of that quite a bit instead of just the diagnostic criteria that currently exists. But, you know, Victor McCusick really wanted to find that gene because that one was the most common, you know, and in medicine, what they like to do is they go in and they find something that hasn't really been done before, and then they try and apply their own theories, and rather than like working with communities to understand what's happening and how to support people, they kind of take their view of the world and say, well, this is what this is, and I'm going to use the scientific method to objectively prove it. So Victor McCusick and his team worked tirelessly for many years, and they didn't find the gene. And then he just never shared the information about it with anyone. So I really think that another part of it is he was hoarding the medical information about hypermobile people and hypermobile conditions and hypermobile disability because, you know, him and his team wanted to find the gene. And then when they couldn't find it, they dropped it because they believe that genetic determinism is a thing, and that if something cannot be genetically identifiable, then it probably isn't real. So we get into then this other part of medicine that's like, if we can't prove it, then it doesn't exist. Anyway, so it's like a whole pot of.
Oh my God. Yeah, it's a huge mess. This is Laura speaking again. It's a huge mess. And I mean, because of the way that research is constructed, people like Victor McCusick learned how to study things. And funny story, you can actually trace his ideology back to eugenicists, including FM Alexander, which is wild. But he, you know, was studying these conditions and yeah, still trying to find the gene for this type of hypermobile disability, even though all the other ones were found, I think, before 2000, except some rarer variants. And they're still trying to find it, but the way that they try to find it is, in quotes again, narrowing the population pool, because they want to try to only study what they consider the most severe cases in order to find some genetic change that they can label as the cause of this, what they consider a disease. So what they did throughout all those decades was just minimize and ignore the fact that hypermobility is extremely common when you look at the patients who come into rheumatology clinics, genetics clinics, and pretend that the majority of people who come in for care, so how could this be true? But the majority of people who come in for care, their hypermobility is what they called benign. They called it benign because they didn't consider it as severe as the other forms of hypermobile conditions, which yes, some of them can be fatal, but so can unmanaged pain and medical abuse be. But they were saying that the things that were not severe enough that they thought they could collect them into some identifiable group of what they consider, again, diseases, they just rejected. And this, I mean, it's just so racist when you look at the fact that the people who come into the clinics, the number jumps to 30 to 60% prevalence. Is that right, Audre, in one study? It's literally doubles in people of color.
Yeah, it's 30 to 60% prevalence, but that's the only demographic data. It's like one study. Like no one really wants to like ask the people what's going on. They're just kind of like, let's make a decision and like narrow it down from that decision. And the what is it called? Nosology, which is essentially like the development of the way that they were identifying hypermobility, which is called the Baton score. Baton, he's still alive. All of that initial research for how to measure flexibility in people's joints was done on Black and Indigenous populations across South Africa and neighboring islands. And so the initial, diagnostic criteria is developed very unethically. But this is also how, the beginning of the vaccine, even in COVID, the beginning of the vaccine testing was done with people in countries that don't have resources. And that's kind of a desperation situation, and that's really exploited. And when someone goes and does human subjects research there, generally those places don't have the same kind of ethical oversight, which isn't a value statement. It's just like the way this, systems are set up. And so the researchers in the US will take advantage of that, because then they don't have to uphold as many, ways of making sure they're not harming people. And then with these statistics, the percentage of people who are diagnosed who are white is 98%. So there's a huge, massive, I mean, it's really wild. And the thing is, these statistics like aren't that hard to figure out. And the scientific community and the hypermobile community, the white hypermobile community that exists that's diagnosed, this really isn't a conversation.
Right. And I mean, this is Laura again. When we look at like the biggest charity in the world for these conditions, they're still trying to find the gene. They're minimizing and really excluding from care people who don't meet their certain level of diagnostic criteria for this really common form of, we said EDS. I don't think we ever said what that stands for. It was named after two people who discover it because that's how medicine works, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. But there are other things that are actually exactly the same as hypermobile EDS. Joint hypermobility syndrome, just hypermobility alone as a word, what they used to call benign joint hypermobility syndrome. And they always recognized that those were more common, but there's actually no difference between them and hypermobile EDS. And yeah, I mean, and when we look at dance, a lot of people may be told that their hypermobility is a thing, that maybe they're really flexible. They're probably just told to strengthen, but a whole bunch of other multi-system, whole body things can happen because it's a connective tissue thing and it's the whole body. So when they just focus on strengthening, first of all, it won't work because proprioception isn't being addressed. And second, or it won't work for everything, and it may cause pressure on the spine and some long-term things. And then the other things won't be cared for at all. And this is happening all across the country in genetics clinics now. They're just saying that primary cares or physiatrists or sports medicine people should be the people to diagnose this, since they recognize that it's not rare at all. But then telling them to only go to physical therapy where they get injured. And then, this is just really related to dance because of how physical problems are dealt with and the lack of access to informed medical care, to somatic practices. It's really all one big thing. But yeah, I think we should get into questions. Is there anything coming into the chat, Jen, Sophia?
Hi, this is Jen. Not yet.
Not yet. All right. Anyone want to break the silence? Oh.
I'll go ahead and read it. This is Jen from Katie and Sophie. Right. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how you find the agency to vocalize what's okay and what's not okay for your body, especially in a class setting or creative process when there is a hierarchy in the room, / how to facilitate a room that allows for choice making to honor your own body. Thank you.
This is Audrey speaking. The first thing, how you find the agency to vocalize what's okay and what's not okay. I think first you kind of have to figure out what that is. And for me, that's like not going to dance class. It's actually just like not entering those spaces that work in those systems in those ways, because it's really hard to do that always, but also in those places where kind of there's a physical competition that maybe isn't even spoken about. I mean, I even think about like my experience in, contemporary downtown New York City artist workshops who talk a lot very openly about how this is for everyone and this can be a practice for everyone. And those spaces still don't really have, that's not a part of it. It's just like, okay, and now we're going to start moving and I'm going to be talking about these things and you're going to be moving and da, 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 da. And so yeah, like removing yourself from that place and then being like, what happens now when I'm not there? And I think, the agency to vocalize what's okay and what's not okay is also really dependent on identity and experience and what that power dynamic specifically is. And there are definitely spaces where it's not okay to vocalize those things because you will be punished. And so I think when thinking about facilitating a space that makes it okay, it's going to be different for every community. I think for every group of people. And, you know, like just naming it, you know, being like, this can be really, I mean, I don't know how you want to say it, you know, but like, if you, something that we do in the beginning of when we teach is we'll be like, if you ever feel any increase in pain or any increase in even slight discomfort, maybe you can't really like put your finger on it, or it's just like, oh, I've kind of felt that before, but I'm not sure. Like that means back off. Like that's an indicator where, so we're like practicing kind of like sensory boundaries of like, when I start to feel that, what happens if I choose not to push through it? And one of the reasons I think that people push through it and why sensorially it starts to become the thing that people really want to do that feels good is because when you micro damage or micro tear connective tissue, oftentimes those receptors end up kind of like becoming numb at some point. And so when people like pop and crack things, and I'm not saying don't do that, because there are times and places when like you need to get something back in, and that totally makes sense. But you know, that subluxation, that popping noise, that means it's a partial dislocation of a joint. That's when you crack any joint, that's what's happening. That's going to cause like a slight micro tear of the connective tissue within the joint, and then it kind of like numbs it. And so then pushing through that pain to get to that numbness is really relieving, because you're in this kind of pattern of chronic subluxation or dislocation or whatever it is, and the numb, you know, gets you through it, which makes sense. But the more that tissue tears, you know, the de-adhesion, the more instability comes later. And so it's even less about being like, you have to say no to this, but talking about what the consequences can be. And also talking about how like making choices to limit your range of motion or whatever it is not like a less than on a value system or an absence of on a value system, or like, let's like take away the value system of like increase versus decrease, or like more, you know, like strength versus like limp or whatever. It's like, oh God, now I'm like losing what I'm saying, but yeah, it's like offering that internalized ableism is conditioned in everyone to a really intense degree, and it's racialized and it's transphobic and it's sexist and it's really harmful. And you know, what if everyone just could find space to like, this sounds really cheesy, but like, you know, create practice around like loving who they are and like what their capacity is, and recognizing that fluctuating capacity is normal in everyone, and pushing through that kind of, you know, moving around a baseline. Yeah, anyways, it just goes into the whole like, we're all burned out and traumatized, and you know, what do we do about it? I don't know. And there's no one answer, I guess, is also what I'm saying. Like,
yeah, this is Laura. Yeah, I mean, it's part of this whole capitalist, colonialist, violent stuff. But like on fostering an anti-ableist classroom, I just want to drop a really basic resource in the chat. You could also email any of us to receive this if the chat is not good for you. It's the 10 Principles of Disability Justice as compiled by Sins Invalid, which I think is a great starting point for teachers and practitioners, artists who are thinking about making their classroom more of this space to foster autonomy. And I just realized we forgot to take our break, which is like bad for us as disabled people to do. Sorry for that. I'm wondering if we want to take a pause now and stay a little late for anyone who can and has more questions. What does everyone think of that?
This is Audrey speaking. So there is one more like question in the chat that came up that I think we can answer quite quickly before we take a break, if that's okay. Jenn says to everyone, I'd love to use my voice, but I'm feeling quite emotional right now as I have never heard such an inclusive conversation on disability justice and access to care in regards to EDS/hypermobility differences. I would love to know, I guess, how do we sign up? I've been searching for more resources and more community around this topic for a long time, and I'm grateful for what you are doing. I've never felt more, in quotes, seen, especially for not knowing you all. And thank you, Jenn, for sharing that. That's very sweet. And I'm going to put our website, if I can spell it right, in the chat, which is like a thesis. So you can visit information there. And then
this is Laura. I'm also going to put our public resource folder, which is another, and it's also accessible through our site. But it has like research papers on these things, presentations on these things, a lot more information about the medical racism stuff and the hypermobility history. And yeah. And you can also just email us. We would love to talk to you.
Yeah, and we like run programming. We're on a bit of a hiatus right now because we have to go on vacation. At some point we have to take vacation. But like email us about what you're interested in, and you know, we're happy to connect you with community and like whoever. We're like all about information sharing and people, you know, connecting people. So anyway.
Yeah. This is Laura again. So I think now, obviously, anyone who needs to leave, you're more than welcome to. And this will be recorded, but does it seem okay with all the admin? And it doesn't have to be all of the admin, but for us to take a quick break now and then hold a little bit more time for questions?
Hi, this is Jenn. I think that works for all of us.
Great. All
Okay.
right.
You want to do 3 minutes, 5 minutes?
3, 5, somewhere between there. Yeah.
I'll keep track and.
Great.
All right.
All right. And bye to anyone who's leaving now. And yeah, we'll be back for more.
Safe in the mud and woe to find us stretching for miles. Neon lights over condo complexes, trash in the street where there used to be no directions, grid work pressed to the earth till it's flat, mathematic ends mild. Don't look back, I already erased all tracks with the wind in my lungs. If you find yourself lost in the desert, just know I left no melody to guide you home. I lost my wings 2 winters ago, but I tried took off my shirt and told you to count all the stars in my skin, but you thought there were scars in the whole damn sky. And I believed you. Guess that's life. I wasted so much time giving all of my raindrops away when I should have been saving them, surrendering dirt to metal and bone. At the end now, looking down at an obvious absence of green, you tried to blame me for flooding the fields, but you never wanted the trees. I like to stay in on Friday nights, dance alone in my room, drink red wine out the bottle, and listen to Blue, reminding myself this is only a dark cocoon.
Hi everyone, it's Jen, and hi Audrey. I want to read a couple things that came up in the chat. Sarah writes, thank you for sharing and making the space. Miles writes, oh wow, friends, thank you. I echo Jen above, feeling seen and heard and supported in ways I didn't know I was seeking. And Jen writes, thank you for the presentation. Be well and happy vacation. I will be in touch. And Miles writes, if time, wondering if you'd be willing to talk more about why you might not approach work directly with someone's neck and head. Also, curious about what happens in a session, lesson, treatment, etc. How do you work with people?
Yeah, this is Laura speaking. Oh, where are you gonna go? We always do this. We can definitely talk about that. I'll address the head and neck stuff first. So this was like a main part of the protocols I began when I was studying Alexander technique and still having to deal with that, for lack of a better word, and excuse my language, ableist bullshit. But the head and neck, so in a hypermobile body, all the connective tissues are different. They're stretchier, they're more fragile, they're what medical calls it laxity. And sometimes people are even told they have lax ligaments, this is in quotes, without being told they have a hypermobile condition that can cause multisystemic things. But anyway, something that's completely left out of all the diagnostic criteria and like all the medical care except specialty neurosurgery is the hypermobility of the spine. And because the spine is connected by connective tissue, literally, it's going to be unstable in someone who's hypermobile. And especially if they've been in dance training, somatics training, people develop a compensatory pattern of kind of over straightening their spine, maybe kind of gripping down to stabilize or overreaching. I mean, these are just kind of the patterns we see, but that is a response to hypermobility in the spine, instability in maybe some of the vertebrae, and the hypermobility and chronic dislocations in the limbs. And in somatics, especially Alexander technique, they go straight to the head first thing, because they think that in doing that, they can organize the rest of the body, which is, maybe that's true for people who aren't hypermobile. I don't really believe that. I do believe that the head and the spine, it houses the central nervous system. It's like it's the most important part of you. So it makes sense that spine organization is really going to affect the rest of the body. But what happens when you go to a hypermobile person's head and neck, especially before addressing any of the other things going on, especially if they're sitting or standing, and you haven't even looked at like what their pelvis is doing, how the whole spine is growing out of the pelvis, and you go straight to the head and neck, what literally happens is vertebrae subluxations, which are partial dislocations. So in this really classic Alexander technique thing they bring someone out of the chair by putting the hand on the head and neck and guiding the body from that place. What can happen when people do that is it literally slides the skull right off the vertebrae, slides the vertebrae around. And this causes some really serious complications and damage. Audrey might want to talk more about that. And that's also really neglected in medicine. But another reason we might not go there, even if someone is relaxed on a massage table first, is because that instability is so uncared for, so unaddressed. And because people, you know, have to get through their day, they're lifting things, doing all kinds of things, the musculature responds to that instability and compensates, especially when, you know, there's like shoulder instability as well and rib instability. It's always going to be part of a constellation of instability, is people have spasticity. They have muscle tension and imbalance patterns that are going to mean going there could be really uncomfortable, really painful. It might kind of trigger some of those spasticity patterns. It can increase pain. It can move around the vertebrae just by triggering something like that. So that's definitely why we avoid it. This is not to say that in working with someone over time, we would never touch anywhere near the neck or head, but it would never be moving it, because it's just going to move away from the rest of the body, and it would never be upright, or it would be, you know, lower on the upper body if they're upright. It would never, ever, ever be the first thing that we do. Audrey?
This is Audrey speaking. And when we say like compensation pattern, or like, none of this is an active choice. Like, this is all automatic responses that like muscles do in the nervous system, with the nervous system, to like, you know, deal with the changing environment and like, you know, the potential falling down or whatever. So with especially like, okay, so the only instability that's measured in medicine is like how far I can tilt my head backward, and then how far I can tilt my head forward. And I'm not gonna do that. Obviously, I don't want to do that. But they don't measure lateral instability. They don't know how to measure any kind of like torsion. And they often will look at an MRI that has like a really intense subluxation, and you see this really bright spot where the vertebrae has totally shifted and the ribs kind of whatever. And they're like, oh, you know, I think that's just a mistake from the machine. Like, they just don't believe that can happen. And we're not totally sure why. And I think it's also because the way that a lot of diagnostic criteria has been created is from war. And so when we're looking at neurological trauma, when we're looking at orthopedic trauma, blah, 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 you know, a lot of that medicine was developed for soldiers to continue in war. And so then the diagnostic criteria formed around these really, you know, these war scenes, which is like not necessarily the kind of acquired situation that someone might have throughout life with hypermobility. And so the way that they measure impact is like from like war. It's just like kind of weird. But the over straightening and then holding is a way to like stop that lateral instability, kind of. And it makes sense that that's happening. But then because, so you have your, oh my God, your atlanto-occipital joint, right? And then you have the hole in your head, essentially, where the spinal cord like comes out from the brain into the canal, and it's floating in fluid. You know, the brain is floating, the whole thing is like suspended. And when that over straightening happens, then the canal gets taller, and then the brain gets closer to the spinal cord and the hole, the opening where that junction is. And that causes CSF flow problems, cerebral spinal fluid flow problems, that fluid we're talking about that kind of bathes the whole central nervous system. And that diagnostic work doesn't exist. And unfortunately, that's really not something that people believe is real in medicine, even though, like, anyway, I could like talk about like, you know, the founding father of neurology and how he was dealing with these people. And then he decided that it was, anyway. So the reality is there's no care. And when you have a CSF flow problem, or your brain is being smooshed in your skull or like into your spinal canal, the lower part of your brain is where all of your like autonomic functioning is primarily, I don't know if you want to say housed. I mean, it's all connected. And so it can cause really significant experiences that are really hard to manage and understand. And people often think that you are faking it, and it's often misdiagnosed as hysteria. And hysteria is a very real diagnosis that still exists. Right now it's called psychogenic non-epileptic seizures, but it's hysteria.
Or conversion disorder, somatization, psychosomatic.
Then we have this whole group of people who have really significant neurological problems that really need care, really need quality of life care, and they're being told that their body's making it up and that their body can't handle the stress that they're under in their life. And they actually sometimes will tell dancers that it makes sense that you've developed hysteria because you express yourself through your body, and because that, you know, thing is coming through your body. So they have this interesting way of spinning it. So I know that's not, you know, the lightest topic, but we just really work with that community, and it's really a huge problem. And so, you know, anything we can do to reduce that possibility from happening or getting worse, because it's not great.
Yeah, this is Laura. So that's why we tried to educate on that, even just touching on it, like just don't go to the head and neck, just don't do it. Start at the lower body, the pelvis, the feet. The pelvis is really important. The waist really gets ignored in a lot of somatics, but because the medical care for it is so disgustingly terrible and so wrapped up in kind of calling these problems psychological, to dismiss the need for care. And then the only care that exists is surgical intervention, when there are actually so many things to try before that. So yeah, that's why we talk about that so much. And as far as like what we do in a session, that really varies, really varies. We would never go to the head or neck first. Usually we're working a lot with the pelvis, the lower body, the waist, the feet and the legs, and like the whole torso, talking about the torso as a whole and educating about the anatomy of the torso and how the limbs kind of wrap into the torso before we get to that really sensitive area that almost all hypermobile people have something going on there, some level of what we call, well, it's what medicine calls craniocervical instability of the head and neck. Which when unmanaged and when injured by things like Alexander technique or physical therapy or dance or whatever, can cause some of the most serious complications for hypermobile people. Yeah, and I think I see one in the chat from, I think, is it Sophia or is it from M? It's from one of them saying, oh, wow, realizing I've had that experience every time I've taken an Alexander technique class. And yes, this is the problem. And Alexander technique really holds on to and hoards that knowledge of what we think is just proprioceptive education. It's just feedback to the nervous system. But within these really genesis ideals of standing and walking and fixing and eliminating disability. Oh, do we have a raised hand?
Well, we may have. I also want to like talk a little bit more about what we do in like a session, but we can do the raised hand first and then I can come back to it as well.
Okay.
Hi, MX here. Thank you for this evening. This has been really so helpful and informative, and I teach somatics, and we have a somatic minor up at Lehman, and so this is giving me really a lot to think about. And so I guess I'm curious. I do want to hear about what you do. Those are some of my other questions. So I don't want to interrupt that, but also just curious if there are really good texts you might recommend to put against some of these, classic Alexander texts that people maybe should be reading in a somatics minor, or because, these critiques are so useful, and I would love to have something, references basically that you feel like really crystallize some of the holistic perspective on approaching this work, maybe that I could share with my students.
This is Laura. We're smiling and grimacing because there isn't really anything, at least not that really addresses this specific hypermobile harm reduction need. There are like wonderful disability justice texts that like really start people thinking about these things differently. Audrey might recommend a couple books when I hand it over to her. But I think one of the only things that exists right now talking about this stuff is some of our own writings. I'm not sure what would be best. We have a presentation on disability access and somatics that is in that resource folder. It might be a good starting place. There are, of course, scientific research papers. Very few of them are worth anything. Most of them are terrible and say that hypermobile people are just anxious, which is really terrible. But there are some that talk about like how prevalent these issues are, but in connection to somatics, people aren't really doing that. So there might be a couple papers. I think I wrote an article a long time ago, and there's that presentation. But Audrey, can you think of anything at all?
This is Audrey speaking. Well, you also have the eugenics paper that you wrote that's in the resource folder. And then there's also in the resource folder the kind of racist history of hypermobile conditions. And then, what was I saying? Oh, we're working with this group. They're called Autosomatica, and they're good friends of ours. And we're working on a like public letter that we've been working on for a year. And we're kind of trying to summarize this from all of our perspectives and, kind of opening the conversation of like, we don't have answers, but like these are things that exist in somatics. And I would also consider looking at disability justice texts and then going to the more classical somatic texts and kind of like cross-referencing to, understand how ableism shows up within language, within curriculum, like gradation, or however you're like progressing, whatever that means. And also, if you want to do the same thing with science research, or if there's something that, is more academic, or I think and we're very, very biased because this is what we think about all the time, but it feels like to us, once you start to notice it, it's quite obvious. And it's really interesting how language is similarly used across these fields, within medicine, within diagnostics, especially around like mental health and madness and things like that. And then somatics, and F.M. Alexander's older books are fantastic. Eugenics is full of really direct quotes. So
yeah, really intense stuff. The cross-referencing is a great idea. Some great disability justice texts would be the Disability Justice Primer, Skin, Tooth, and Bone. The Basis of Movement is Our People. That's by Sins Invalid. I think all of these are in our disability justice resource list that's in this resource folder. Also, Care Work by Alila Lakshmi Piepsna Samarsina would be a great one to read. And then I did just drop an article I wrote, I forgot about, on Alexander technique and hypermobility specifically into that folder as well.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Yeah. And if anyone finds texts that also, I mean, please,
please let us know.
read them as well, you know, or if anyone is writing something, or, you know, anyone doing this kind of work. I think, you know, in the somatic spaces that we, you know, first entered in before we left it, it's hard to find community around that. So
it's really not a conversation. But yeah, I think in some other communities it's starting to be, which is really exciting. Audre, do you want to talk about more what we do in a session?
Like normally what we would do is an in-person thing, but it's COVID, you know, so we do an online version, and it's verbal, and it's not accessible for everyone, and it's not accessible for all hypermobile people either. It's not safe for everyone who's hypermobile, and we very much recognize that. In person, we would have like a massage table, and someone would come in, and if they feel comfortable lying down, you know, that would be kind of the optimal. We kind of want to take away like you know, just stress on the body, I guess.
Yeah. And like most somatics, they want you to be in as active a position as possible. Often in AT, they start you seated, but as restful as possible is great, because if the muscles aren't working to hold you up, then that proprioceptive information can be less kind of confusing.
Because, this is Audre speaking, when muscles are active, that tension you feel is those receptors being squished. And so when those muscles aren't active and you don't have that squishing sensation or that squishing feedback, that's often, I'm air quotes here, louder than just like the receptors near your skin on your thigh. I don't know. You know, that's kind of what is, the brain is in air quotes paying more attention to, but that's not, you don't, it's not really a part of it necessarily, is the active attention. So what we're doing is kind of setting someone up in the most comfortable position. Sometimes, you know, things under their elbows so that their arms are going more back into their sockets and they're not kind of coming out, just because of even that slight 1 to 2 inch what the hell, height difference can cause instability to worsen. You know, really supporting out of hyperextension, bent knees, maybe there's something under people's ankles, kind of whatever is useful. Sometimes a rolled up t-shirt underneath someone's neck, just as kind of like a contact surface reminder. So a lot of the things we're adding as props aren't really for pressure, or we kind of want to even avoid going into any kind of like pressure or traction or, you know, like physical air quotes manipulation, but you know what I mean. And then that way, that kind of just like touch of, okay, this is like the, I don't know, it's like the edge of your skin or something, you know, maybe on a certain part of your body. Then because all of that muscle receptor feedback isn't so loud, the brain is like, aha, now we get this. So that's the theory. Yeah.
This is Laura. And yeah, one more thing I don't think we talked about regarding Alexander technique is this idea of directions. The head like leading, and that like they call it in quotes forward and up in Alexander technique. And I'm saying that really kind of bitchily because of our experiences, but those directions, and there are a whole bunch of other ones, and teachers are taught that when they put the hands on, they need to be thinking those directions so that the person can learn them from their hands. And we do not do that at all. That's really, in our opinion, coming from this idea of fixing, whether the teacher is consciously thinking, I'm going to fix this person, or God forbid, thinking, eliminate their disability. Most teachers wouldn't admit that that's what they're thinking, or even think cognitively that that's what they're thinking. But the ethos that created those practices is definitely based on that. So when we touch, it's really just providing information. It's really just feedback. It's like this really simple scientific thing, in our opinion, that isn't really that convoluted. It isn't that complicated. People don't have to study forever and ever to understand those directions in order to get something from that feedback. And they don't have to be, you know, actively aware, like we said earlier, to get something from that feedback. So we're definitely not directing or manipulating into the tissues. We might be thinking about a lot of anatomical specificity, different qualities of touch to kind of give information about different layers of tissue, but no directions, and certainly none of those classical directions. We really completely left Alexander technique behind. It's just the usefulness of the touch that is prevalent in all somatic practice, most somatic practices.
Yeah. And in the session where the feedback goes, aha, oftentimes, you know, I'll just be asking someone, is it okay if I move my hands here now? You know, I get consent, go there. Is it okay if I move my hands here now? Get consent, go there, you know, and kind of also, like, if I notice someone is, I don't know, their facial expression changes, or maybe face color shifts, or whatever, like checking in, like, you know, did you feel an increase in pain? Like, just always acknowledging that whatever we're doing, just because we talk about it in the way that we do and we think about it in the way that we do, doesn't mean that it's not going to potentially hurt someone. Like, we don't know what someone needs, and their sensation is really the only thing that can let us all know. So really, like, finding that dialogue, just being like, you know, I'm doing this for you because it's real hard to do it to yourself. You know, and we've actually, that's something we're trying to teach now too, though, is self-touch, because it is like such an important thing. And then people can really explore on their own without someone's presence there. The safety of the shoulders staying together can be complicated with self-touch. And so that, you know, we usually introduce self-touch a bit later, once, you know, we kind of all know a little bit more what patterns may exist, or kind of what people are experiencing. And we'll talk about anatomy. Sometimes classes are like just me talking about science. Sometimes happens. Sometimes classes are talking about care access. Sometimes classes are people just having a conversation, hanging out. Sometimes we'll do that at the end of a class, or the second part of a class. And those are group classes, the Zoom classes. But the Zoom classes are, you know, verbally guided, and we try and bring in anatomy before we do some of the more specific verbal guidance, so that there's some reference. And then we always start with sensory integration, which is more just kind of like bringing it not outside of the body, but like temperature of the air, and where are the light sources in the room, and how can light, you know, kind of come to you. The molecules actually vibrate towards your eye, you know, so what if, like, that's just kind of practicing sense reception in some way, but kind of from like a whole sense perspective. And then, you know, that can kind of also support, and some people, that's really what they need, and some people that doesn't work. So anyway, I'll end there with that.
And this is Laura. We should wrap up soon, but does anyone have any burning questions? Voice or chat? Or thoughts?
Yeah.
Hi, this is Kay Fox speaking, or Caitlin, it's my full formal name. First off, I just wanted to say how, helpful and informational and inspiring this whole Zoom talk has been. I'm a dancer and dance teacher, and I've been working on a Pilates certification and really trying to be more critical of my ableist tendencies in both of those forms. And I came to Pilates because of like an injury, and kind of got into this group of hip dysplasia, and I saw a lot of people having EDS in the hip dysplasia community, and these people getting this really intense, really, I found traumatizing surgery. And I just feel like I now have like a place to potentially direct them to your work and information. And I am really excited about maybe bridging more of that gap, because I just really feel I'm not hypermobile. I do have chronic pain, but I just really wanted to say thank you. And I am going to follow up on your website, and thank you for doing the work that other people are not doing right now, and then providing that and sharing that with the community, because I think it's really important. And yeah, I'm just really glad I got here tonight. So thank you to you both, and to Free School and to Jen for facilitating all this. That's really all I wanted to say.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Yeah. But like, what if we all just shared information, like, and we weren't like, you have to pay this much, or we weren't like, it's such a different, well, and then it becomes like information is community, right? It's not even like who's identifying information. It's like the information is the community. So, blah, blah, blah. Anyway.
Yeah, this is Laura. Yeah, thanks so much for coming. And yeah, Pilates is a place where that gap is really needed to be bridged, and we're happy to be a resource. And I just like also want to make a note on like us doing this work. It's really because we have certain privileges and certain resources that we're able to dedicate all our time to spreading this information and providing resources. And there are so many people out there with so much to provide. A lot of them are like really struggling to survive. And so we really don't want that to be the case forever, which is why we do what we do and try to get care access to everybody. But like, it is definitely not about us. And, we hope that, and we believe that 5 to 10 years from now, there will be so many people doing this work. Mm-hmm. And being able to do it publicly and dedicate that time to it and be supported and paid and respected in doing that work. Yeah.
Hi, this is Jen. There's a from Mel. It is so important. Thank you as always. Heart. Laura writes heart. Yeah. This is still Jen. Audrey, did you want to say something?
This is Audrey. No, I'm just talking to myself, and I should probably be muted. So I'll mute
now. Well, I wanted to say that I know you've talked before about how your work stems into multiple communities, and I'm glad that the dance community is one of them. And thank you for being a part of it and continuing to stay connected, because it is really important for us and for all. Thanks for sharing for so much of yourself this evening, and so much information, and like those be like so many words to say word.
Oh yeah, this is Laura. Yeah, I mean, we can really flood. It's just such a gap. So there's so much to say always, but we're here as a continued resource. And I mean, thank you, Jen. Thank you, Em and Sophia. Thank you, Free School. This is not a space we've ever had where we were allowed to talk about this within the dance community. That was actively punished. And just really not listened to. So that's really exciting to see that happening since it's so needed. And yeah, we're here. The resources are there. They're going to keep building and keep building. Our website really is a thesis. There's like a giant science thesis and a giant accessibility and disability thesis, and lots of information. And we are on a hiatus from our ABNR class right now, and that class is normally only for hypermobile people, whether you're diagnosed or not, self-diagnosed, questioning, and other disabled people and neurodivergent people. And also to plug, we're going to be hosting a practitioner education course next fall. So if you are interested in that, you can email us. You can sign up for our email list. Actually, let me drop our link tree in the chat as well. And that has a direct sign up for our mailing list link. And yeah, please let us know if you need anything, whether you're Hyp, maybe think you are. We call it Hyp. That's our shorthand. I was sick of having to say and spell hypermobile. So that's all that is. Here's our link tree, and I think they put our payment info in the chat. And I think that might also be in our link tree. And yeah, thank you all so much for coming. Audrey or anyone, you have any final goodbyes?
Well, this is Audrey speaking. I just remembered I'm sorry, I'm responding to something we were talking about earlier, but I just remembered when we were talking to a college somatics class at College of the Atlantic, and they were also asking like, where are the resources? Where do we go? And our response was, you make it. There is no place to go, you make it. So I think somatics is very open for that moment.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, it's been so denied. It has to be made everywhere. And we need as many people in that fight as possible. Yeah.
Amazing. This is Jenn. I want to say just a reminder that if you are interested in having a space to show performance ideas, you can apply for the Fern Performance Series by tomorrow, April 9th. The application is on the freeskewl website, freeskewl.com. And thank you so much again. We will take a week off, or two weeks off, and then on April 29th, Lisa Nelson will be joining us to talk. Yeah, thank you again, Audrey and Laura, so much.